Everyone thinks they know the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the noble fight against tyranny. But what if I told you that everything you learned about 1789 was carefully sanitized propaganda? What if the truth about those blood-soaked years was far more horrifying than any history textbook dared to reveal? The French Revolution wasn't just a political uprising. It was humanity's descent into madness, where neighbor turned against neighbor, where children denounced their parents to the guillotine, and where the very concept of mercy was declared an enemy of the state. For 10 years, France became a laboratory of terror that would make Stalin's purges look restrained. You've heard about Marie Antoinette's famous words, "Let them eat cake," except she never said them. You've been told about the storming of the Bastille as a heroic act of liberation. But the fortress held only 7 prisoners. And the real reason for the attack was far more sinister. You know about the guillotine as a humane method of execution, but you don't know about the experiments conducted on the severed heads or the sexual rituals that surrounded the public beheadings. Behind the noble rhetoric of rights and revolution lay a machinery of death so efficient, so methodical, and so perverted that it traumatized an entire generation of Europeans. The revolutionaries didn't just kill their enemies. They industrialized murder, turning execution into entertainment and terror into policy. But here's what they really don't want you to know. The French Revolution was never about liberty. It was about power. Raw, absolute power wielded by men who discovered that once you start cutting off heads, it becomes impossible to stop. And the most chilling part? Some of them never wanted to stop. If you think you're ready to learn what really happened when civilization collapsed in the heart of Europe, then subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments if you've ever questioned what you were taught about this period. Because once you know the truth about the French Revolution, you'll never look at political movements the same way again. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know. France in the 1780s was a society on the brink. The king, Louis XVI, was weak and indecisive. The queen, Marie Antoinette, was foreign and extravagant. The nobility lived in luxury while peasants starved. The financial system was collapsing under the weight of debt from foreign wars. The Enlightenment had spread new ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty. Social tensions reached a breaking point, and the people rose up to claim their freedom. This is the sanitized version. The neat linear narrative that makes the revolution seem inevitable and even justified. According to this story, 1789 marked the beginning of the modern world, when feudalism finally gave way to democracy, when superstition yielded to reason, when the common people finally threw off the chains of aristocratic oppression. The revolution, we're told, proceeded in logical stages. First came the financial crisis and the calling of the Estates General. Then, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly and took the tennis court oath. The people stormed the Bastille, adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and gradually reformed the ancient regime. There were some excesses during the Terror, of course, but these were unfortunate aberrations, the price paid for progress. The key figures fit neatly into their assigned roles. Robespierre was the incorruptible idealist who took his principles too far. Danton was the pragmatic revolutionary who tried to moderate the violence. Marat was the radical journalist who inflamed the masses. Marie Antoinette was the symbol of aristocratic decadence who paid for the sins of her class. Even the violence was sanitized, quick, clean deaths by guillotine, replacing the barbaric tortures of the old regime. This version presents the revolution as fundamentally rational, even when it turned violent. The terror wasn't random bloodlust, but a calculated response to internal and external threats. The Revolutionary Wars weren't naked aggression, but defensive responses to monarchist coalitions. The de-Christianization campaign wasn't anti-religious fanaticism, but the logical extension of Enlightenment secularism. Most importantly, this narrative suggests that the revolution succeeded in its ultimate goals. Despite the temporary chaos, it established the principles that would eventually triumph throughout the democratic world. The blood spilled was regrettable but necessary, the birth pangs of modern liberty. France emerged from the revolutionary decades scarred but transformed, ready to spread its message of liberation across Europe. This comfortable story makes the French Revolution comprehensible, even inspiring. It allows us to see it as an essential step in humanity's march toward progress. It reassures us that even when political change turns violent, it serves a higher purpose. It suggests that the revolutionaries, despite their flaws, were fundamentally on the right side of history. But what if this entire narrative is a lie? What if the real French Revolution was something far darker, far more disturbing, and far more relevant to our own dangerous times? The first crack in the official story appears when you examine what actually happened on July 14, 1789. Yes, an angry crowd stormed the Bastille fortress. But they weren't liberating hundreds of political prisoners. They found exactly 7 inmates, including 4 forgers, 2 mentally ill men, and 1 aristocrat imprisoned for sexual deviance. The real target wasn't the prisoners, but the gunpowder stored in the fortress's arsenal. But here's what they don't tell you about that day. The crowd didn't just demand the garrison's surrender. When the fortress's governor, Bernard-René de Launay, finally agreed to open the gates, the mob brutally murdered him despite his cooperation. They hacked off his head with a butcher's knife, stuck it on a pike, and paraded it through the streets of Paris. The head of the chief magistrate suffered the same fate. This wasn't liberation. It was a preview of the industrial-scale murder that would follow. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, proclaimed just weeks later, sounds noble enough. But read the fine print, and you'll discover something chilling. It explicitly reserves the right to suspend those very rights whenever the nation's security is threatened. In other words, the revolution's founding document contained the legal framework for its own destruction. The revolutionaries weren't creating protections against tyranny. They were writing themselves a blank check for future oppression. The assault on the church reveals the revolution's true nature even more clearly. This wasn't simply about separating church and state or reducing clerical power. The revolutionaries launched a systematic campaign to eradicate Christianity from French life. They closed churches, forced priests to marry, melted down religious artifacts for bullets, and converted Notre Dame into a temple of reason, where they staged blasphemous ceremonies featuring near-naked actresses posing as goddesses. But the sexual dimension of the anti-religious campaign was even more disturbing. Revolutionary pamphlets didn't just attack the church's political power, they spread pornographic stories about priests and nuns, often accompanied by graphic illustrations. The revolution's leaders understood that the fastest way to destroy traditional authority was to sexualize and degrade it. They were pioneering techniques that modern propagandists would later perfect. The economic policies were equally radical and equally disastrous. The revolutionaries didn't just redistribute wealth, they attempted to remake the entire basis of property rights. They seized church lands, confiscated noble estates, and issued paper money backed by nothing more than revolutionary optimism. The result was catastrophic inflation that destroyed the savings of ordinary people while enriching speculators and government insiders. Even more telling was the revolution's treatment of regional differences. France before 1789 was a diverse collection of provinces, each with its own customs, laws, and languages. The revolutionaries systematically destroyed this diversity, imposing a single centralized system on the entire country. When regions like the Vendée resisted, the response was genocidal violence that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The revolutionary calendar reveals the movement's totalitarian ambitions most clearly. They didn't just change the government, they tried to change time itself. The new calendar eliminated Sundays, saints' days, and Christian holidays, replacing them with festivals celebrating revolutionary virtues. They renamed the months, redefined the weeks, and even attempted to introduce decimal time with 10-hour days. This wasn't reform. It was an attempt to sever the French people's connection to their entire cultural inheritance. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of early revolutionary policy was the law of suspects, passed in September 1793. This law defined suspected enemies of the revolution so broadly that virtually anyone could be arrested and executed. You could be condemned for not having constantly manifested their attachment to the revolution, or for having relations with the enemies of liberty. In other words, insufficiently enthusiastic support for the regime became a capital crime. The machinery of terror that emerged from these policies wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was the logical result of a revolutionary ideology that recognized no limits on its power to remake society and human nature itself. Now let me tell you about a woman whose story perfectly embodies the revolution's descent into madness. Her name was Olympe de Gouges, and her fate illustrates how quickly revolutionary idealism turned into cannibalistic violence. Born Marie Gouges in 1748, she was the daughter of a butcher who transformed herself into one of the most radical voices of the early revolution. She wrote plays attacking slavery, pamphlets demanding women's rights, and political manifestos calling for sweeping social reforms. In 1791, she penned the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, directly challenging the revolution's exclusion of women from political participation. De Gouges wasn't content with theoretical equality. She demanded practical changes: the right of women to own property, to divorce, to speak in political assemblies, even to serve in the military. She established organizations to help unwed mothers, advocated for social welfare systems, and called for the abolition of marriage as a form of property transaction. In many ways, her vision was more radical than that of the male revolutionary leaders. But as the revolution radicalized, de Gouges found herself increasingly isolated. Her writings began to criticize the growing authoritarianism of the Jacobin faction. She questioned the necessity of the terror, called for moderation in dealing with political enemies, and dared to suggest that the revolution was betraying its own principles. Most dangerously, she published a pamphlet called The Three Urns that proposed allowing the French people to choose between different forms of government through a referendum. This was heresy to the revolutionary leadership, who claimed to represent the will of the people while systematically suppressing any actual expression of popular opinion. De Gouges had committed the ultimate crime in the eyes of the terror. She had suggested that the people might not want the revolution that was being imposed upon them in their name. The personal details of her destruction reveal the revolution's sadistic character. She was arrested in July 1793 on charges of being an enemy of the sovereignty of the people. The evidence against her consisted entirely of her writings calling for democratic reforms. During her imprisonment, she was subjected to psychological torture designed to break her spirit before her execution. Revolutionary officials would visit her cell to inform her that her son had been arrested and would be executed unless she confessed her crimes against the revolution. They told her that her friends had been guillotined and that she would share their fate unless she renounced her political writings. They offered her freedom if she would publicly praise Robespierre and acknowledge the righteousness of the terror. De Gouges refused every compromise. On November 3, 1793, she was taken to the scaffold. But her execution wasn't simply a matter of judicial process. It was designed as public entertainment. The crowd that gathered to watch her die included many of the same people who had once applauded her plays, calling for social justice. Now they cheered as the woman who had demanded their liberation was butchered before their eyes. The revolutionary newspapers celebrated her death with pornographic descriptions of her final moments. They mocked her appearance, invented stories about her sexual behavior, and claimed that her execution proved the superiority of male reason over female emotion. The woman who had demanded equal rights was destroyed by the very movement she had helped to create. But de Gouges' story doesn't end with her death. Revolutionary authorities ordered that her body be dissected for medical research, denying her even the dignity of a proper burial. Her writings were banned, her plays removed from theaters, and her name erased from revolutionary histories. The movement that claimed to champion human rights literally tried to erase a woman from history for the crime of demanding those rights be extended to her sex. Even more chilling is what happened to her family. Her son, despite having no involvement in politics, was imprisoned for months as punishment for his mother's crimes. When he was finally released, he was forced to publicly denounce her memory and praise the wisdom of the revolutionary government. The revolution's cruelty extended beyond the grave, punishing even the innocent relatives of its victims. De Gouges' fate became a template for thousands of other victims. The pattern was always the same. Revolutionary idealists would be celebrated as heroes when their ideas served the movement's purposes, then destroyed when those same ideas became inconvenient. The revolution devoured its own children with the same efficiency it applied to its declared enemies. Her story also reveals the revolution's fundamental hypocrisy about women's roles. While revolutionary propaganda claimed to liberate women from traditional constraints, the reality was quite different. Women were encouraged to participate in politics only as long as they supported the male leadership without question. The moment they began to think and act independently, they became enemies of the people. This brings us to the darkest chapter of the revolutionary decade, the systematic transformation of political disagreement into mass murder. By 1794, the machinery of the terror had achieved a precision that would impress even modern totalitarian regimes. The statistics alone are staggering. Between September 1793 and July 1794, a period of just 10 months, revolutionary tribunals condemned over 16,000 people to death. But these numbers only capture official executions in Paris. In the provinces, the killing was even more extensive and far more creative in its cruelty. In Lyon, rebellious citizens were blown apart with cannons in what revolutionaries called fusillades. In Toulon, suspected counter-revolutionaries were loaded onto barges that were then sunk in the harbor. In Nantes, the revolutionary representative Jean-Baptiste Carrier organized Republican marriages. Naked men and women were tied together and thrown into the Loire River to drown. Carrier justified these mass drownings as necessary to purify France of its enemies. But perhaps the most horrifying campaign of extermination took place in the Vendée region of western France. When the deeply Catholic peasants of this area rebelled against revolutionary conscription and religious persecution, the government's response was explicitly genocidal. General François-Joseph Westermann reported to his superiors, "There is no more Vendée. It died with its wives and children under our free sword." I have just buried it in the woods and marshes. Following the orders you gave me, I crushed the children under the feet of horses, massacred the women who, those at least, will not give birth to any more brigands. I do not have a single prisoner to reproach myself with. I have exterminated all. The revolutionary armies didn't just kill soldiers. They systematically murdered civilians, burned entire villages, poisoned wells, and destroyed crops to create artificial famines. Conservative estimates suggest that over 170,000 people died in the Vendée alone, representing roughly 20% of the region's population. Some historians argue the death toll was even higher. The revolutionaries developed increasingly sophisticated methods for processing their victims efficiently. The guillotine, originally designed as a humane form of execution, became an instrument of mass production. In Paris, executioner Charles-Henri Sanson and his assistants could decapitate a dozen people in less than 13 minutes. The device was constantly in use, requiring frequent sharpening of the blade and replacement of the wooden components that became saturated with blood. The public nature of these executions served multiple purposes beyond simple intimidation. Revolutionary leaders understood that regular exposure to extreme violence would desensitize the population and make them complicit in the regime's crimes. Citizens who attended executions weren't just passive spectators. They became participants in a ritual of collective murder. The crowds that gathered around the guillotine developed their own subculture of death. Professional knitters would occupy the same seats day after day, continuing their work while watching heads roll. Children sold drinks and snacks to spectators. Entrepreneurs hawked souvenirs, including small model guillotines that became popular toys. Some spectators brought handkerchiefs to soak in the blood of famous victims, treating the liquid as a revolutionary relic. Sexual elements permeated the execution ritual in ways that revealed the revolution's fundamental perversity. Women who attended executions regularly were called tricoteuses, knitters, but their real function was erotic. Many were prostitutes who used the sexually charged atmosphere around the scaffold to attract customers. The phallic symbolism of the guillotine's blade wasn't lost on contemporary observers, who noted the orgasmic shouts of the crowd when particularly hated victims were killed. The revolutionary government systematized even the disposal of corpses. Bodies were thrown into mass graves with quicklime to accelerate decomposition and prevent the spread of disease. But the sheer volume of killing overwhelmed even these efficient methods. Paris graveyards overflowed, creating health hazards that forced authorities to relocate burial sites outside the city. The revolution was literally producing more dead bodies than French society could absorb. Revolutionary leaders didn't just tolerate this violence, they celebrated it as evidence of popular enthusiasm for their cause. Maximilien Robespierre, the so-called incorruptible, regularly attended executions and was visibly aroused by the spectacle of death. His private correspondence reveals a man intoxicated by his power over life and death, someone who had discovered that killing could become addictive. But the most chilling aspect of the terror was its bureaucratic character. Revolutionary tribunals processed victims with the same methodical efficiency that modern governments use to issue driver's licenses. Standardized forms were developed for different categories of enemies. Death sentences were signed and filed in triplicate. Statistics were compiled and submitted to higher authorities. The revolution had industrialized murder decades before the factory system industrialized production. As the body count mounted, even some revolutionary leaders began to recognize that the movement was consuming itself. But by then, the machinery of terror had developed its own momentum. Anyone who suggested moderation immediately became suspect themselves. The revolution had created a system in which the only safety lay in advocating for ever greater levels of violence against ever broader categories of enemies. The end came with stunning suddenness on the 9th of Thermidor, July 27, 1794. Maximilien Robespierre himself, the architect of the terror, was overthrown and executed by former allies who feared they would be his next victims. But his fall didn't represent a victory of moderation over extremism. It was simply the moment when the revolutionary leadership decided that Robespierre had become more dangerous to them alive than dead. The conspiracy against Robespierre reveals the terror's true nature more clearly than any ideological analysis. His enemies didn't oppose him because they disagreed with his methods. They had enthusiastically participated in mass murder for months. They moved against him because they realized he was planning to have them killed next. The conspiracy was motivated entirely by self-preservation, not moral awakening. Even Robespierre's execution followed the same ritualistic pattern he had imposed on thousands of victims. The crowd that gathered to watch him die included many people who had cheered his previous appearances at the scaffold. When the executioner held up his severed head, the same spectators who had applauded his victims now celebrated his destruction. The revolution had trained its people to find entertainment in death, regardless of the victim's identity. But here's what the history books don't tell you about Robespierre's final hours. He attempted suicide the night before his execution by shooting himself in the jaw. The wound was painful but not fatal, leaving him unable to speak clearly during his trial. When he was finally placed on the guillotine, the executioner ripped off the bandage covering his wound, causing him to scream in agony before the blade fell. Even in death, Robespierre experienced the same cruelty he had inflicted on so many others. The fall of Robespierre didn't end the revolution's violence. It simply redirected it. The new leadership, calling itself the Thermidoran Reaction, immediately began hunting down Robespierre's supporters with the same systematic brutality that had characterized the terror itself. Over 100 Jacobins were executed in the weeks following Robespierre's death, and thousands more were imprisoned or exiled. What emerged from this chaos wasn't the restoration of freedom, but a different form of authoritarianism. The Directory that ruled France from 1795 to 1799 was corrupt, militaristic, and increasingly dependent on the army to maintain power. The stage was set for Napoleon Bonaparte's coup, which replaced revolutionary democracy with outright military dictatorship. The revolution's international impact was equally devastating. Revolutionary France's aggressive wars spread violence across Europe for over 2 decades, killing millions and destroying the political stability that had maintained peace since 1648. The revolutionary slogan, "War to the palaces, peace to the cottages," became a justification for unlimited military aggression against any nation that refused to accept French revolutionary principles. But the most lasting damage wasn't political or military. It was psychological. The French Revolution demonstrated that civilized society could collapse almost overnight, that neighbors could turn into executioners, and that high-minded ideological rhetoric could justify almost any atrocity. It established templates for mass murder that would be perfected by 20th century totalitarian movements. The revolution also revealed the ease with which democratic participation could be manipulated to serve authoritarian ends. The sans-culottes who filled the streets of Paris weren't oppressed peasants fighting for their freedom. They were urban artisans and shopkeepers who had been radicalized by systematic propaganda campaigns. Their spontaneous demonstrations were carefully orchestrated by political organizations, that understood how to channel popular emotions toward violent ends. Most importantly, the French Revolution proved that good intentions provided no protection against moral corruption when power was unlimited. Every major revolutionary leader began with genuine idealism and ended as a participant in mass murder. The revolution didn't fail because bad people hijacked a good cause. It failed because unlimited power inevitably corrupts even those who begin with the best intentions. The patterns established during the revolutionary decade would be repeated throughout the modern era. The Bolsheviks who seized power in Russia explicitly modeled themselves on the French Jacobins. The Chinese Communist Party studied revolutionary methods when planning their own campaigns of political extermination. Even 20th century fascist movements borrowed organizational techniques first developed during the Terror. Yet perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the French Revolution is how successfully its crimes have been sanitized and rationalized. Textbooks still present the Terror as an unfortunate excess rather than the logical culmination of revolutionary ideology. Popular culture continues to romanticize figures like Robespierre and Danton, despite their participation in mass murder. The revolution's victims have been largely forgotten while its perpetrators are remembered as tragic heroes. This historical amnesia isn't accidental. Modern democratic societies need to believe that political change can be achieved through peaceful means, that violence is always exceptional rather than inherent to radical transformation. Confronting the truth about the French Revolution would force uncomfortable questions about the nature of political power and the reliability of popular movements. But the archives don't lie. Hidden in libraries across France and Europe are thousands of documents that reveal the revolution's true character. Execution lists signed by local officials, letters from provincial administrators describing mass killings, financial records showing payments to executioners and gravediggers, medical reports on victims of revolutionary violence. These sources paint a picture of systematic brutality that far exceeds what most people imagine. Some of these documents remain classified even today, more than 2 centuries after the events they describe. The French government continues to restrict access to certain revolutionary archives, claiming that full disclosure might damage France's international reputation or inflame social tensions. What could be so shocking that it still requires concealment after all these years? Recent archaeological discoveries have confirmed some of the revolution's hidden atrocities. Excavations in Paris have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of unidentified skeletons, many showing evidence of violent death. Similar discoveries in provincial cities have revealed the true scale of revolutionary killing outside the capital. Physical evidence continues to surface that contradicts the sanitized historical narrative. The French Revolution matters today because its patterns continue to repeat. Every generation produces movements that promise to transform society through righteous violence, that claim to represent the authentic will of the people, that justify present suffering as the price of future liberation. The same rhetorical techniques, organizational methods, and psychological manipulations that characterize the Jacobin movement appear in contemporary political movements across the ideological spectrum. Understanding what really happened between 1789 and 1799 isn't just a matter of historical curiosity. It's essential preparation for recognizing similar dangers in our own time. The French Revolution shows us how quickly civilization can collapse when political restraints are abandoned, how easily ordinary people can be transformed into executioners, and how thin the line is between liberation and terror. The revolution's most important lesson may be the oldest one in politics: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The French revolutionaries believed they could avoid this trap through democratic participation and ideological purity. Instead, they demonstrated that these very qualities could accelerate rather than prevent moral collapse. So, the next time you hear politicians promising to overthrow corrupt elites, create a more equal society, or implement the true will of the people, remember what happened in France between 1789 and 1799. Remember that good intentions provide no protection against evil outcomes. Remember that the road to hell is paved with revolutionary rhetoric. And remember that those who forget the lessons of the French Revolution are doomed to repeat them. The archives are open, the evidence is clear, and the warning is unmistakable. The only question is whether we're wise enough to listen. If this deep dive into the dark reality of the French Revolution has opened your eyes to how historical narratives can be manipulated, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the hidden truths behind major historical events. And let me know in the comments, what other heroic historical movements do you think deserve a closer, more critical examination? Because the truth is always more complex and often more disturbing than the story.